the prime directive, is that a progressive or reactionary element of the Federation?
That's a great question. And Gene Roddenberry is wrong. I'm genuinely not interested. I will play a judge. Guilty. Bourgeois society is coming for you. She tried to invoke a kind of final solution. Bourgeois society is a bit like the Borg. However, because after all, what is Star Trek about? It's about, to coin a phrase from Kamala Harris, to steal Clinton's phrase, Abigail Thorne is imagining some kind of prime directive. That's not going to happen. In fact, that was never going to happen. In fact, the only possibility for landback would be an absolute collapse. Q is going to sit in judgment of humanity. And by the way, what he really means at Q when he's talking about humanity there is bourgeois society.
Welcome, everybody. I am back with James Vaughn for the third time. James Vaughn is a historian of the British Empire and the Atlantic world in the 18th century, instructional professor in the college and affiliate faculty in the history department at the University of Chicago, the author of The Politics of Empire at the Accession of George III, and a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. James, welcome back to the channel.
Thanks for having me. I'm grateful to be here.
The subject for today is another video like we did the first time, and this is from PhilosophyTube, aka Abigail Thorne, formerly Ollie Thorne, Oliver Thorne. They have 1.6 million followers, so pretty influential left tuber, and this video in particular got 285,000 views so far, and it's called Rationalizing Colonialism: How the US Stole Indian Land. Overall thesis of the video is that America was a settler colonial project which intended to wipe out the Native American population from the continent from the outset, and that Thomas Jefferson in particular was instrumental in facilitating this slow-moving genocide. Overall, I think her main argument about Jefferson was that he was two-faced, that he said nice things in public, but he was nefarious and dastardly in private, and that was the real him. James, since you saw the video, why don't you just give us your overall impressions of the video itself?
So my overall impression, Eamon, is that historically speaking, factually speaking, I think what she lays out is broadly true. But in terms of historical interpretation, in terms of one's take on the video, if you will, I disagree with it.
Let's go one by one, and we'll take some clips and quotes that she plucks out from Jefferson and from others, and we'll talk about them one by one.
However we may wish in time to extend our possessions, the doing it at this time in that quarter cannot be worth a war, nor the loss of the affections of the Indians.
Well, that sounds nice. But he goes on.
There is perhaps no method more irresistible in obtaining lands from them than letting them get in debt, which, when too heavy to be paid, they are always willing to lop off by a cession of lands.
I think this is a classic strategy for acquiring land, property in bourgeois society. And I hope I'm not going too far ahead of where you want to go, Eamon, at this time. But the way that she frames not only this question, but indeed the whole video, is that Jefferson is basically interested in imposing a European way of life on indigenous people. And I think that's really a gross mischaracterization of what's going on. That is to say, he's interested of expanding a bourgeois way of life. By which I mean the way of life not of Europeans, qua Europeans, but the way of life of Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries as they have been transformed by the rise and development of bourgeois society. And so Jefferson is interested in expanding universal bourgeois society. There's no question about that. And one of the ways that bourgeois society peaceably expands, as opposed to conquest and expropriation, is precisely commercial sale. That is to say, the purchase of property peaceably on the market. And it's not merely in North America with settlers buying land from indigenous people. It also happens in Western Europe, where people who want to buy improving lands from what are viewed as unimproving landlords, whether they're in Eastern Europe or Ireland or some section of the continent, classically kind of bourgeois property owners will basically lend to get those subjects in debt and then to peaceably acquire their land. So what Jefferson is proposing here is a peaceable strategy for the incorporation of indigenous peoples in North America into the developing bourgeois society there, no different from how such strategies have been put in place and unfolded in Europe itself at the same time and in preceding centuries. So my only objection to this is that it is not some nefarious plan to impose a European culture over an indigenous culture. It rather is about the expansion, the universalization of bourgeois society. And I should say that there are other people at the same time that don't want Jefferson's method. That is to say, they want the forcible expropriation of land through conquest and violence. So I think to historically properly adjudicate and appreciate what Jefferson is saying here, you need to understand that he's talking about the expansion of universal bourgeois society. And you need to understand that he is basically talking about how a peaceable strategy should be pursued against other voices in the halls of power. He's speaking against other voices in the halls of power that want a more open, coercive, violent strategy of expropriation.
Sure, but to play devil's advocate here for Abigail, um, are there not, if indeed Jefferson and the Americans saw the Native Americans as equals, equal partners, or just as equals, would they not pick a more democratic or more friendly way of dealing with land trades and purchases than this seemingly underhanded way of getting them into debt and putting them uh, in a tough position where they had no choice but to get rid of the land?
Yes, that's a fair point. I would say two things as a response to that. One, this strategy of indebtedness is seen as a more peaceable way to do things. But two, this strategy of indebtedness is part of a much wider strategy that we see talked about throughout Jefferson's presidency. And you'll note here that this letter to Henry Dearborn on the screen is written in August 1802.
Hmm.
Jefferson is president from March 1801 to March 1809. So it's during his presidency. And he pursues a very broad strategy of trying to incorporate indigenous people into what he calls civilized society, right? What we might call modern society or bourgeois society. That is, Jefferson absolutely sees bourgeois society as being universally applicable to humanity. He doesn't think it's something inherently European. He thinks it's something that's universally applicable to humanity, that it is something that can help fulfill and indeed go beyond the natural potentials of all human beings and all human communities. So Jefferson is a very broad strategy of incorporating indigenous peoples into the United States of America and more broadly into what he calls civilized society, what I would insist on calling as a Marxist bourgeois society. And furthermore, the strategy of indebtedness is really quite one of the second tier or second tier elements. Sorry, within that wider strategy, indebtedness is a really second tier element. The first tier element, which he makes very clear to Lewis and Clark when they go on their expedition, just to set the scene for you, Amon. Of course, the Louisiana Purchase is being negotiated in this period. And in 1803, 1804, when the purchase has been made and it's being finalized and going through Congress and all of that, Lewis and Clark are sent on an expedition in 1803. And in the instructions to them, the strategy that Jefferson lays out very clearly in his instructions to Lewis and Clark is that the indigenous people should be treated as if though they are now citizens of the future citizens of the United States of America. They now fall under the sovereignty of the United States of America. Jefferson understands that that was not in their will, in their agency. He understands that the United States, he, Jefferson himself as president, has concluded a treaty with the Emperor Napoleon of France, and that the indigenous people had no role or agency in that treaty making process. But from his view, they're now under the sovereignty of the United States. But of course, that is something they didn't participate in. So he instructs Lewis and Clark as they proceed throughout the vast area. Louisiana Purchase, just for your listeners, is not today's state of Louisiana. It's more or less
Huge.
yeah, it's huge. It doubles the size of the United States. It goes from the southeastern United States all the way to the Pacific Northwest, including the whole Trans-Appalachian territory across the Mississippi River. I mean, it includes the Trans-Appalachian territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. And then it includes territory going well west past the Mississippi River, all the way to today's state of Oregon. And it's a vast territory, and it's largely inhabited by indigenous peoples. There's only a few European settlers, American settlers throughout it. And so he's instructing Lewis and Clark, tread gently, right? These are people with their own ways of life, their own habits, their own customs, etc. But what you should do is enter into peaceful diplomatic negotiations with them, begin to figure out where we can set up commercial outposts and marketplaces, areas relatively free of indigenous people where we can send people to settle. And his basic vision, Eamon, is that you will have commercial family farmers moving west into territories relatively unsettled by indigenous people and developing family farms. You will have trading outposts and marketplaces being set up. And eventually you'll have small towns arising with artisans and craftsmen and small scale manufacturing. And the indigenous communities will be drawn in by the pull of bourgeois society, or what Jefferson calls civilized society, to give up their more rudimentary forms of agriculture and their forms of hunting and gathering in order to be able to settle down and transform the land more maximally, so make it more productive, provide more for themselves, and then enter into commercial market relations with the settler communities around them and become fully rights-bearing citizens of the United States. That's his vision. Yes, it's absolutely the case. He thinks that if that you want to have pull factors, you want to make people attracted to what he calls civilized society, what I would call bourgeois society. But he also has a second tier case for push factors like this indebtedness. But I want to be clear about this. Jefferson is very straightforward. The United States is now sovereign over these lands, right? And so therefore, everybody in there has to be incorporated under the sovereignty of the United States. And it's therefore the real debate at the time is how that incorporation is going to take place, right? And if you place that debate in its own time, you see that Jefferson is very much on what I would call the radical bourgeois side of that debate, which is incorporation through the universal appeal of bourgeois society and the slow pull of people into bourgeois society.
So on that point, looking back at it through today's lens, which most leftists do, that that strategy still appears like a project of assimilation, a project of termination of their culture and their ways of knowing, their ways of being. I'm going to read another quote that Abigail features from Jefferson here.
In this way, our settlements will gradually circumscribe and approach the Indians, and they will in time either incorporate with us as citizens of the United States or remove beyond the Mississippi. The former is certainly the termination of their history most happy for themselves. But in the whole course of this, it is essential to cultivate their love. As to their fear, we presume that our strength and their weakness is now so visible that they must see we have only to shut our hand to crush them, and that all our liberalities to them proceed from motives of pure humanity only. Should any tribe be foolhardy enough to take up the hatchet at any time, the seizing of the whole country of that tribe and driving them across the Mississippi as the only condition of peace would be an example to others and a furtherance of our final consolidation.
What Jefferson is describing there is an end to traditional Indian ways of living. He doesn't want the United States to exist alongside the Indian nations as equals. He intends to take them over. A final consolidation.
Well, I am talking about Jefferson here, obviously, but I'd like to use bourgeois society as a kind of collective subject, as if I could for a moment. Bourgeois society is restless, it's ceaseless, it's expansive. I mean, Marx talks about this throughout all of his writings, probably most famously in the Communist Manifesto, where he talks about, right, that bourgeois society is going to envelop the whole world and create a world in its image, a thoroughly bourgeois world. It's restless, it's ceaseless, it's dynamic, it's expansive. It's coming. And there's no question that bourgeois society, right, intends to incorporate the whole of the world in its processes of production, exchange, and consumption. Because the whole of the world, from the understanding of bourgeois society, is basically going to be one in which you have peace and prosperity and the end of war and predation and coercion. And bourgeois society, I'm just going to be brutal about this, Amon. I'm just going to speak historically, right? I'm not speaking from the perspective of morality, okay? I am speaking from the perspective of human history here. Bourgeois society is going to attempt to make sure that all violence and coercion and predation is eliminated from the world, and that the whole world is basically rendered interdependent in peaceful, sociable relations of free labor and the exchange of its products. And it is not going to tolerate, it indeed has not tolerated, neither in Europe nor as it's unfolded in North America, any violence, right? That is to say, it has not tolerated violence from the outside. Now, it has often included violence. You know, one should not erase that at all. The expansion of bourgeois society has often included incredible violence, conquest, expropriation, slavery, forcible resettlement. There's no question about that, right? But bourgeois society is coming for the whole world. Its intention is to include the whole world in its social relations of free labor and the exchange of its products. And therefore, the real question is that expropriation going to be taken out as it's largely been undertaken prior to the American Revolution, forcibly, coercively, right? In which Native American, you know, in some cases, the lands of indigenous communities in North America are peaceably acquired through diplomacy and trade. But in many cases, the lands of indigenous communities in North America are violently, coercively acquired through war and conquest and expropriation. And if we look at the entire period of the colonial settlement of British North America, roughly from the early 17th century to the American Revolution, we see a process that entails a great deal of violent expropriation of the lands of indigenous communities. The question that is being posed with the American Revolution and following the American Revolution is, are things going to continue like that, or the more radical bourgeois potential, which Jefferson is inhabiting, right, is embodying, is constituting, that this process of the expansion of universal bourgeois society could actually happen more peaceably. So I guess I would just speak from the perspective of history, entirely amorally. Bourgeois society is coming for you. Everybody all over the world. And that has already happened in Western Europe in the period we're talking about, the late 18th, early 19th century. It's happening in the Americas, it's happening in Eastern Europe, it's happening in Africa, it's happening in Asia, etc. Bourgeois society is coming for you. And the question is the incorporation going to be violent and coercive, or is it going to be, as Jefferson is talking about here, more peaceably, sociably be conducted? And I'll just conclude by saying one last thing, Eamon. I can't emphasize this enough. This has all been playing out in Europe, right? This is not something new that's happening, meaning there are many indigenous lifeways throughout Europe, north, south, east, and west, that are resisting coming into bourgeois society. And in some cases, people are peaceably incorporated into bourgeois society. In other cases, they're violently, coercively incorporated into bourgeois society. But what's really, really, really being posed here, the question, the really important debate in 1802, 1803, when these letters are from, is whether or not indigenous people's land should be expropriated and they should be forced further west, or whether or not indigenous people should be incorporated into the United States and given full rights of citizenship. And there can be no question which side Jefferson's on. I have two issues with Abigail Thorne's perspective. On one hand, she sort of states the case as if though there would have been just two societies harmonious living next to each other in North America, a European way of life and an indigenous way of life. Now, I have a number of issues with that perspective. First, it's not a European way of life that's expanding to North America. It's a bourgeois way of life. Europe has already been both violently and peaceably transformed. And there were many indigenous ways of life back in Europe that didn't want to be transformed and were transformed peaceably or violently. So it's a bourgeois way of life that's coming to North America. And it's not one indigenous way of life on the other side, right? There are many different indigenous ways of life, all of which have been in contest violently often with one another. And so the bourgeois way of life basically has this view of it's going to incorporate everything into its interdependent processes of production, exchange, and consumption, of transforming people into peaceable, sociable, free laborers, exchanging the products of their labor. So the bourgeois way of life is coming. I'm sorry, it just is.
Can you just expand a bit on what makes the bourgeois way of life and bourgeois society not just another culture among many?
Here it is. Now, of course, this is complicated by the facts that Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto in 1848 after the Industrial Revolution, meaning after bourgeois society has come into contradiction and crisis, right? Because we have the full development of what Marx calls the capitalist mode of production in the 19th century. And that leads to industrialization and proletarianization, a crisis of bourgeois society. But nevertheless, I believe what Marx is saying here about bourgeois society in the capitalist mode of production holds for bourgeois society in its entire life process, more or less from the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Reformation through to today, okay? In other words, what I'm about to say, I think applies to bourgeois society in its entire life process from, let's say, 1400, 1500 to today.
What chapter?
Just chapter 1, bourgeois and proletarians.
Right.
The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country, to the great chagrin of reactionists. By the way, reactionists who aren't just, here I think he's largely thinking of people mostly in his native land of, German-speaking Central Europe, where the reactionists are basically decrying the spread of bourgeois society. But we could apply this to indigenous communities the world over, okay? To the great chagrin of reactionists, it is drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones, industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in any quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. And from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. And then I'll finish with this key paragraph. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. Okay? That's what I'm saying. And by the way, that's not really original to Marx and Engels. You can read lines similar to that in Adam Smith's An Inquiry into the Nature, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and also the Abbé Raynal's Philosophical and Political History of European Expansion in the East and West Indies. That is a common trope of the High Enlightenment. What Marx and Engels are invoking there, that is the world being remade. Of course, in the High Enlightenment, writers such as Abbé Raynal and Adam Smith didn't use bourgeois society. They would talk about modern society or commercial society, or Hegel talks about it as the modern post-Germanic world, etc. They all have different terms of expression. But you can find tropes like that, lines like that in the Abbé Raynal, in Adam Smith, in Hegel, so on and so forth. That's not original to Marx and Engels. Bourgeois society is restless and expansive, right? It's going to essentially, because at its heart, Amon, I mean, maybe this is a better answer to your question, but at its heart, right, it's essentially seeking to do two things. It's basically has a process by which society is much greater than the sum of its parts. That is, you've created an extensive division of labor. People are focusing on making one making one product or offering one service that they're particularly good at, or they're focusing on working for somebody who offers such a good or service to the market.
Right. So I'm a personal trainer. I'm good at that. That type of thing wouldn't be seen in these other forms of cultures, is what you're saying.
Here's how I would put it. Once bourgeois society starts getting off the ground, principally in Western Europe, at the end of the Middle Ages. So here we're talking about the 15th and 16th century, the 1400s and 1500s CE. What I mean when I say it's relentlessly expansive, it's ceaseless in its kind of dynamism and its expansion, is it basically is transform. People have already become free laborers. But what's happening now, Eamon, is people are basically trying to figure out how to reproduce themselves, right? In the old feudal way of life that dominated Western Europe for much of the Middle Ages, people were more or less born into their lot in life, okay? But now, essentially, serfdom, slavery, every form of unfree labor comes to an end in Europe west of the Elbe River from about 1500 onward. And those free laborers are looking for ways to produce and reproduce themselves. They're looking for employment. If they can find it locally, they will. If they can't, they'll move. If one good or service they offer doesn't find a market, doesn't adequately vent or get valorized, as Marx would put it, they'll create some other good or service that does. And what happens as that process gets set in place is that you get an incredibly extending division of labor and incredibly expanding market. In other words, more and more people are specializing in focusing on offering one product or service to the market that they're good at or working for somebody who does. And because you're getting extending division of labor, those people are in turn all being rendered market dependent, meaning they essentially are making one thing. They're not making everything. Therefore, they're going to make that one thing well. They're going to vent it in the market. They're going to make money, and they're going to go back out to the market and buy everything else they need to make. Guess what? The good news is that there are lots of other people making stuff, so they can find on the market everything they need, and they can usually find it in a much higher quality, lower cost than they could make it. And so this is being driven from the bottom up. This world is being driven from the bottom up by free laborers seeking to improve, to first off stabilize their existence, and then over time to gradually improve it. And this is a ceaselessly expansive dynamic that is going to see people searching for new forms of employment, searching for new goods and services to offer to the market, searching for new markets to sell to, and indeed not just moving around Western Europe, where we see a great deal of mobility developing in the early modern era, but even spilling over the shores of Western Europe into the rest of the world, right? Into Asia, into Africa, and then crossing the Atlantic and discovering for Europeans, for people from the old world, Europeans, African, and Asians, the Americas, and expanding to the Americas. So bourgeois society is coming. It's restlessly expansive, all right? And by the time Jefferson is president, bourgeois society is incredibly well developed on the eastern seaboard of North America, and indeed already expanding very well into the Trans-Appalachian West. And basically, that's a world of commercial of commercial family farmers. That's a world of artisans and craftsmen. That's a world of bankers, merchants, lawyers, and of course, on the eastern seaboard, particularly in the southern United States, there is a sizable population of enslaved people working in slave plantations. But that slavery actually is not fundamental to bourgeois society. Rather, it's an effect of the development of bourgeois society. If I could just say one more thing about that. In the ancient world, and here I'm simply cribbing from Marx. I'm sorry, I can't remember. He may say this in the Grundrisse or somewhere else, but I'm basically just purely cribbing from Marx from what I'm about to say. In Greco-Roman antiquity, in the ancient world, whether you're talking about a place like Egypt or Greece or Rome, slavery is essential. It's foundational to society. You need some people constantly involved in slave labor for other people to be free. In bourgeois society, what's foundational is free labor. If you don't have free labor, bourgeois society would have never taken place. However, what happens when the unfolding of bourgeois society, particularly when Western Europeans cross the Atlantic and begin to conquer and settle colonies in the New World, what happens is there's a shortage of free labor in the New World, right? They can't, European planters in the New World, let's talk about British North America. British North American planters can't get enough free labor, right, to work there. Why? Because they're finding these societies with very few laborers to work them and great amounts of land to work. And essentially, indigenous people are not going to settle down for all the reasons we've already talked about, or I think should be obvious to your audience. Indigenous communities are not going to settle down to work this kind of backbreaking, difficult labor for low wages on plantations. And so what they turn to is European indentured servants, meaning British North American planters. We're talking in Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, then expanding elsewhere. They are basically going to try and offer, European free laborers, mostly English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, but also some people on the continent, particularly Germans, etc., to cross the Atlantic and to work for a time, 5, 10, 15 years, signing an indenture where they're basically on free laborers, at the end of which they get their freedom dues, right? A bit of land and capital to then move on, become small farmers. But eventually those planters find that they can't get any of those indentured servants to stay. They'd much rather be small family farmers providing for themselves than servants to other people on plantations where you do difficult backbreaking work in the heat and you get paid a low wage. So they basically need to import a labor force, and they turn to West Africa, where obviously as Europeans have been expanding as part of bourgeois society, they've discovered a well-developed slave trade in West Africa between the kingdoms and principalities of West Africa, and they essentially glom onto that slave trade, and they begin buying an incredible amount of West African slaves, and they become the biggest purchaser. And in fact, what had been a trade largely in prisoners of war suddenly gets driven by European commercialism, meaning West African kingdoms and tribes begin to go to war with one another to capture slaves to sell to Europeans. Why does that slave labor force exist? It exists because British North American planters and other planters in the New World need those slave laborers as a captive labor force to work for them, right? Why are they able to do that? Well, Eamon, they're able to do that because basically bourgeois society has expanded so incredibly in Western Europe that many, many common laborers in Western Europe have more disposable income than common laborers have ever had before in human history. And some of the most prized commodities of these free laborers with disposable income in Western Europe are what are called the colonial commodities or the overseas commodities: tobacco, coffee, calicos, chintzes, muslins from Asia. Principally, the greatest commodity of world history and up and through the 17th century is tobacco, right? And so basically, if you go and set up a slave plantation in North America, you can make a killing selling tobacco to common free laborers back in Western Europe. But you need a captive labor force. So they bring in slave laborers from West Africa. And I think I've explained then how bourgeois society fundamentally depends on free labor, and slave labor is a secondary effect of the development of bourgeois society as it emerges in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And Jefferson, and I promise I'll conclude here, I know I've gone on too long. Jefferson is a radical bourgeois thinker, okay? We can see Jefferson from the 1760s is essentially become very aware of the fact of what he calls civilized society, how it has created a zone of incredible peace and commerce and sociability. So Jefferson is a thinker of the High Enlightenment. In other words, he's a thinker of the period in Western history where intellectuals and writers have made self-conscious the development of modern society or bourgeois society. That is to say, what is the Enlightenment at its heart? At its heart, the Enlightenment, this world of salons and a reading public and intellectuals and writers and so on. The Enlightenment is the making self-conscious, self-aware, the European reading public of the fact they've undergone a profound social transformation, that they are no longer living in Europe as it was in the epoch of Greco-Roman antiquity, the Roman Empire, or Europe as it was in the medieval epoch, that they're living in a wholly new epoch, which they call by various names: the post-Germanic world, the modern world, commercial society, civilized society, what have you. And Jefferson is one of those thinkers of the High Enlightenment who is aware of the fact that this new form of society, what he calls civilized society, what we might call, Eamon, as Marxist bourgeois society, has developed. And bourgeois society makes people more peaceful, more productive, and more sociable than they've ever been before. It creates a zone of peace and prosperity and progress amidst the free laborers who participate in it. But he's also aware of the fact that as what he calls civilized society or bourgeois society has unfolded, it has entailed a great deal of violence, coercion, expropriation, enslavement. He's aware of the fact that his beloved United States and its antecedent, British colonial North America, violently, coercively expropriated a lot of land from indigenous people of North America. He's aware of the fact that his beloved United States and its antecedent, colonial British North America, violently, coercively captured people in West Africa across the Atlantic and led them to what Orlando Patterson calls a social death, right? Put them in a society where they were enslaved. They were not allowed full sociability and communication with other human beings. So they weren't just ripped out of their own societies. They weren't fully integrated in a new society. They were not allowed full communication and sociability with the society around them. And so as a result, if I can just take that term social death, Jefferson is aware of the fact that bourgeois society in its actual historical unfolding has treated indigenous people in North America and the people of West Africa, particularly the enslaved people transported across the Atlantic, barbarously. It's visited a social death upon them. So Jefferson is a participant in a discussion going on in what's called the Republic of Letters, the world of enlightened public opinion, where people are publishing pamphlets, publishing newspapers, publishing books, meeting in salons and coffee houses and pubs and market squares and discussing and debating things with one another. And in that world of enlightened public opinion, there's a radical bourgeois thought that is developed. And it's trying to think how they can use what's good about bourgeois society and eliminate what's bad about bourgeois society. I'm sorry to speak so crudely, but there's an old line from Bill Clinton I like. He said in one of his inaugurations, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. What people like Jefferson think, very crudely, is there's nothing wrong with civilized society or bourgeois society that can't be fixed by what's right with civilized society or bourgeois society. And so radical bourgeois thinkers like Jefferson are trying to think, how can we use what's emancipatory about bourgeois society? That it transforms everybody into freely self-determining laborers who then enter into social relations with one another, that enter into interdependence with one another to exchange their labor and its products, and in doing so, set in train a process that is incredibly dynamic and expansive, that makes people more prosperous and more
Free.
free and more, frankly speaking, self-determining, yes, free, than they've ever been before. And how can that be done in a way that eliminates enslavement, eliminates the violent expropriation of indigenous people and the pushing of them violently westward? How can that be done in a way that incorporates them? So it's no accident that Jefferson is thinking for much of his mature intellectual and political life about how does one possibly bring a gradual end to slavery in British North America come the United States? How does one gradually, peaceably, sociably incorporate indigenous people into British North America come the United States? If that thinks, that's really how we should be thinking about the period. So I have no factual dispute with Abigail Thorne. I just think that she's a presentist. I think she's thinking from the present and present kind of social justice warrior, present PC identity politics, or what we might not call woke concerns, and morally adjudicating the past as a kind of judge. And I'm trying to say, if we take a proper historical perspective, we can see bourgeois society is coming. And the whole world's going to be incorporated in it. And we should see Jefferson as a radical bourgeois thinker who's trying to think how that can be done peaceably and sociably in a way that benefits not only the people already in bourgeois society, but the people who are going to be incorporated into it. How can, to use Marxist terminology, the Chinese walls be battered down to everybody's benefit? Now, the final thing I will say, Ayman, the caveat to all of this is I am talking about the world before the Industrial Revolution, right? We're in 1802, 1803 here with those letters Abigail Thorne put in her video. Therefore, we're just on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. You know, only really in the British Isles and to some degree, kind of Northwestern Europe, Belgium, are we getting the first stirrings of full-blown industrialization. Of course, it's going to really take off in the years immediately after these letters, right? In the 1800s, the 1810s, the 1820s is its real period of takeoff in Northwestern Europe.
Right. AKA capitalism is when that takes off. Why don't we take a look at
Yes.
one of these examples of presentism in Abigail's perspective on what you just mentioned about pushing westwards and how that affected the indigenous population.
What Jefferson is describing there is an end to traditional Indian ways of living. He doesn't want the United States to exist alongside the Indian nations as equals. He intends to take them over, a final consolidation. His collection of Indian artifacts now appears in quite a different light. Jefferson preserved Indian art and languages, But there's never any suggestion from his policy platform that he intended to allow those things to continue being made. He preserves them for museums. The Indians don't have value to him in themselves for who and what they are. They only have value insofar as they might serve the United States. And if they don't want to serve the United States, or don't even want to be a part of it, Jefferson is apparently willing to force them. You might have picked up on that line about removal beyond the Mississippi. At the time, the Mississippi River marked the United States western border, and you might be thinking, oh, well, Jefferson doesn't want them gone forever, just moved over there. But consider this letter he writes to Attorney General John Breckinridge, also in 1803.
When we shall be full on this side, we may lay off a range of states on the western bank from the head to the mouth, and so range after range, advancing compactly as we multiply.
In that last sentence, Jefferson acknowledges that the United States will, in his vision, someday expand beyond the western bank of the Mississippi. Therefore, any deal he makes with the Indians for lands on the west side now will only be temporary. And he knows it. We also see in his letters from this time that Jefferson explicitly orders his subordinates not to tell the Indians that this is the plan. His letter to Harrison concludes with this.
You will also perceive how sacredly this letter must be kept within your own breast, and especially how improper to be understood by the Indians. For their interests and their tranquility, it is best they should see only the present state of their history.
In 1803, he also writes again to Benjamin Hawkins, the same guy he wrote to 15 years earlier, talking about justice. And oh, how times have changed.
The ultimate point of rest and happiness for the Indians is to let our settlements and theirs meet and blend together, to intermix and become one people, incorporating themselves with us as citizens of the U.S. It is possible, perhaps probable, that this idea may be so novel as that it might shock the Indians were it even hinted to them. Of course, you will keep it for your own reflection.
This is already pretty bad.
In this clip, Abigail is really making the United States and bourgeois society seem like the Borg from Star Trek. And speaking of the Borg from Star Trek, keen viewers may have noticed that voice you just heard was, in fact, Commander Riker from Star Trek The Next Generation. I don't know how she roped him into that, but that's, well done, Abigail, I guess. What's your response to that perspective from Abigail there?
I'm sorry to digress, Eamon, but I grew up on Star Trek The Next Generation. It's one of my favorite shows. And when you first sent me this video over a week ago, I was watching it and I wasn't reading the little voiced over by Jonathan Frakes, but eventually I was like, this sounds familiar. And then at the end in the credits, there's a picture of him. She thanks him for doing the voiceovers. And I was like, that's Commander Riker. No, that's exactly it. Actually, you know what? This isn't going to be a direction. There's something relevant here, which is to say, Abigail Thorne has a view that we can relate to Star Trek The Next Generation. Because after all, what is Star Trek about? It's about the restless expansion of bourgeois society throughout the entire universe.
Space communism.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's kind of a gray area. It's unclear. It seems to, what the if we can use this kind of language, with the organization of social life is in the Federation or the Earth. But we certainly can see that it's post-capitalist.
It's not capitalist, yeah.
Right. I mean, if you want to call it socialist or presumably something far beyond that. But in some sense, I don't mean to say that Star Trek The Next Generation is about, right, the expansion of capitalism. It's not at all about that. But broadly speaking, it participates in a meta-narrative, or the way I would see it, as part of a meta-narrative of human history about the restless expansion of bourgeois society. That bourgeois society is restlessly expanding across the world from the later Middle Ages, and in the Star Trek universe, it's restlessly expanding across the solar system, okay, and beyond. Now, in Star Trek, I don't know how familiar you are with it, Eamon, so I can explain more, but there's something called the Prime Directive.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that? Okay. So just for your listeners, the Prime Directive basically says if the Federation, right, you've got Captain Kirk, and then especially the one I love, Captain Picard, you've got them, not the new series, which is horrible, by the way, if your viewers haven't seen it yet. The new Picard series is horrible. But the Next Generation is wonderful. And Picard and his crew are, bebopping and scatting all over the galaxy. And if they come across life forms that are less advanced than them, right, that are not appropriate to be you enter into formal diplomatic relations with the Federation and kind of associate with them and begin cooperating and integrating with them. Rather, you have to pursue something called the prime directive. You basically leave them alone, right? And this is a feature of many of the Star Trek series where they come across life forms that are not ready yet for space travel and for knowing about alien life. And therefore, they're always saying, should we help them because they're dying of some disease or they're going to nuclear war or something? I've forgotten the episodes, but that's a constant theme. Abigail Thorne is imagining some kind of prime directive could take place in the early modern world. That's what she's basically saying, that as European settlers came to North America and came across indigenous communities, they could have just settled their own way of life in areas relatively free of pre-existing communities and allowed indigenous communities to persist. Or let's even think about Jefferson as president. She's basically saying Jefferson could have just kept the United States west of the Mississippi River, allowed this European way of life. Again, it's not a European way of life, it's a bourgeois way of life to develop in the United States, and just followed a kind of prime directive, not interfered with the indigenous way of life, if you will. Again, I will insist there were many different indigenous ways of life. You can't really refer to them all as one way of life west of the Mississippi. That's her broad view, a kind of Star Trek, United Federation of Planets prime directive. United States should have stayed west of the Mississippi, inhabiting a bourgeois way of life, and left everyone west of the Mississippi to inhabit an indigenous way of life. That's not going to happen. In fact, that was never going to happen. In fact, the British Empire actually attempted this, Amon. At the end of the 7 Years' War, British ministers and officials in London began introducing imperial reforms. They essentially want to transform the British North American colonies in a politically autocratic and economically extractive direction. And as part of those imperial reforms, the Prime Minister, George Grenville, has the King George III, issue in the fall of 1763 a royal proclamation which forbids any colonial settlement, any expansion of settlers west of the Appalachian mountain range, right? So the Royal Proclamation of 1763 basically draws a line, right? And basically says all colonial settlement in British North America must remain more or less east of the Appalachian Mountains, kind of hugging the seacoast, right? And that is essentially done for two reasons. One, the imperial forms want more to control the colonies, so they want to prevent them from kind of restlessly, ceaselessly expanding westward. So they want to keep them near the seacoast where there's better control. And two, they want to station a 10,000-man peacetime standing army of redcoats along the western frontier. So essentially, there are not wars between colonial settlers and indigenous people. And those wars tend to generate a great deal of costs militarily and administratively. And those costs basically are incurred in London. And London, because of the 7 Years' War, is already in a massive debt crisis. And because it's attempted to tax its own population to meet that debt crisis, it's actually now in a huge political crisis because there's a movement for parliamentary reform in London and the provincial urban centers demanding no taxation without representation. Okay, so basically, King George III and Prime Minister George Grenville and the British ministers and officials across London, let me just say the British ruling class as a kind of collective entity has said there can be no westward expansion of colonial British North American society. That really is impossible. Why? For all the reasons we've already discussed, right? Outside the slave plantations, colonial British North America consists of free family farmers, free artisans, free craftsmen in towns and cities, free merchants, lawyers. It's restlessly expansive. They're going to keep pressing west to find new lands to settle and to create to find new markets to sell goods to, and to find new raw materials to acquire, to sell in markets, and to work up as new manufactured goods. It is impossible to stop bourgeois society. So the only question is, Are you going to have bourgeois society expand as it's been expanding, ruthlessly, coercively, where settlers go out, they trample on indigenous communities, or they trigger some war between indigenous people and colonial settlers, in which there's a great deal of violence and coercion and land theft and expropriation? Or are you going to have a peaceable, sociable, diplomatic process of incorporation? So here's the simple truth, Amon. I think that bourgeois society is a bit like the Borg. However, in other words, restlessly, ceaselessly expansive, right? But it's restlessly, ceaselessly expansive in the freedom of it, in the with a consciousness of its freedom. And in that sense, Amon, it's not like the Borg.
It's like the
Okay?
Federation?
Yes, precisely. Except there couldn't be no prime directive, right? Abigail Thorne wants a kind of prime directive where the United States will never go west of will never go west of the Mississippi River. The British Empire had already tried to do that at the end of the 7 Years' War with the Royal Proclamation. They already tried to introduce a prime directive where they said there couldn't be colonial settlers west. And in fact, they used a lot of the language that Abigail Thorne used. It's actually a kind of somewhat romantic reactionary language of preserving indigenous ways of life, right? And you can read British ministers and officials, they essentially talk about kind of a nature preserve west of the Appalachian mountain ranges, where a kind of more savage way of life will be preserved, okay? But bourgeois society is like the Borg. It's not going to recognize any limits on its expansion. So on one sense, I agree with you. Or I agree with Abigail Thorne. You can talk about the expansion of bourgeois society like the expansion of the Borg. It's restless. It's ceaseless. It's not going to recognize limits. But on the other hand, it's very different from the Borg because it has a consciousness of its own freedom. That is to say, bourgeois society has generated a historical consciousness that is in the heart of bourgeois society in Western Europe. The Enlightenment has developed. And the Enlightenment has not developed because Western Europe is European. The Enlightenment has developed because Western Europe has become bourgeois. And therefore, there are more people writing newspapers, writing pamphlets, writing books, discussing, debating, going to salons, going to coffee shops, going to pubs, participating in public opinion than ever before. And in that world, there has arisen amongst intellectual works a self-consciousness of the fact that humans, the fundamental basis of human existence, the fundamental grounds of our existence is society. We create these things much greater than ourselves, called society. We create these things much greater than the sum of their parts, called societies, right? Human beings are fundamentally sociable, social animals. They enter into profound reciprocal relations with one another that transform each other in their relations, transform their innermost selves, their inwardness, their inner mindedness, their inner consciousness, and transform the natural environment around them. So in other words, there has arisen in the Enlightenment, at the heart of bourgeois society in Western Europe, a self-awareness of two things: one, society, and two, history. What do I mean by society? What I mean by society is there's arisen a self-awareness that the fundamental grounds of human existence is not really individual humans themselves or God or gods. Rather, the fundamental grounds of human existence is society. The total reciprocal relations that human beings enter into that are much greater than the sum of their parts, that transform the way humans relate to one another, how humans relate to their inwardness, their consciousness, their self-consciousness, their self-awareness, and how they relate to the natural environment, right? The ecology around them. And that those societies have their own dynamics and that they transform in time over history. That there was something like a different society in the ancient world than there was in the medieval world. And there's something like a very different society in the modern world. And furthermore, they're aware of the fact that what's happened in the modern world, or what we might call the bourgeois world, the society that has arisen, is different because it allows for much greater individual and collective human freedom, self-determination. It allows for much greater productivity and progress. As Marx says in that very same Communist Manifesto we just talked about, who knew what powers slept in the lap of social labor? What he means by that is who knew how much human societies, how much the totality of human reciprocal relations could transform the natural world. Well, in bourgeois society, the natural world is transformed much more than ever before. Bourgeois society is much, much more productive than ever before. And then finally, Amon, bourgeois society has prompted the development of a new kind of consciousness, unlike ever before. It's a genuinely free consciousness. That is to say, an awareness of the fact that human beings primarily fundamentally exist in society, that that's the fundamental grounds of our existence, and that those societies change over time in history, and that we can participate individually and collectively together in transforming those societies and therefore in transforming ourselves. And that develops a very profound consciousness, not only of who we are, but also of who we might be, who we might become. To coin a phrase from our most recent Vice President, Kamala Harris, we are free to become something new, unburdened by what we have been. I can't remember how she...
Imagine what can be and be unburdened by what has been, you know? What can be, unburdened by what has been. What can be, unburdened by what has been. What can be, unburdened by what has been. What can be, unburdened by what has been.
Yes, and that is honestly a wonderful self-understanding of radical bourgeois thought, that bourgeois society makes us capable of becoming anything unburdened by what we've been, if that makes sense.
Kamala the radical.
Right. So just to conclude with this whole Star Trek analogy, you'll forgive me, right? Bourgeois society is like the Borg, restlessly, ceaselessly expansive. It's not going to recognize any limit, but it's also unlike the Borg because it's become self-conscious, self-aware. It's aware of the fact that it's a society, and that it's a society that is historically different from all prior forms of society. And it's aware of the fact that people can individually and collectively participate in the society in a way to transform it, a way to improve it, to make it better, to include more people into it, to make people more free and more self-determining than ever before. And in that sense, it is a restless expansion, but it's a restless expansion in freedom. And so the real genuine debate going on here is that expansion going to happen violently and coercively? And is it going to throw people outside of bourgeois society, i.e. remove indigenous people, from bourgeois society? Or is it going to happen peaceably, sociably, and incorporate people in bourgeois society and make them citizens of the United States? So that's how I differ, right? And the final thing I will say, of course, she says, what's the language she uses? Tried to invoke a kind of final solution.
Should any tribe be foolhardy enough to take up the hatchet at any time, the seizing of the whole country of that tribe and driving them across the Mississippi as the only condition of peace would be an example to others and a furtherance of our final consolidation.
Yes. So she invokes, or if it's Jonathan Frakes, I can't remember, he invokes final consolidation in a very nefarious language, as if though final solution, eliminationism, etc. Now, it should be very clear that what Jefferson is saying there is actually in no way unique to him. That's actually pretty much the policy of the George Washington administration from 1789 to 1797, and then the John Adams administration from 1797 to 1801. That is, they want hospitable, peaceful, diplomatic relations with indigenous communities. They bring many of them into the capital, New York and Philadelphia, and later Washington, D.C. to meet with. But they always say, we should not, fully reveal the fact that we intend to expand all the way to the other coast. Now, that isn't because they have some secret plan to eliminate them. That's because they have this view, if you expand what they call civilized society or commercial society, ineluctably the attractiveness of such a society to indigenous communities will bring them in to bourgeois society, will peaceably, hospitably, sociably incorporate them into the United States as rights-bearing citizens. and as free laborers,
Right, because
commercial family farmers, artisans, craftsmen, etc.
it's going to happen either way, so they might as well do it this way.
Yeah. Now, I want to be very clear about this. Jefferson, like Adams and Washington before him, are very clear expansion should be peaceable. But if there is a kind of violent outbreak that was not provoked by settlers going west, if it was provoked by indigenous people, the kind of language Jefferson uses there is not unique also. That is, we should quickly, harshly deal with the violent invasion or incursion. It will set an example to encourage peaceable relations. Right? So bourgeois society, because of its incredible dynamism and productivity, is able to generate much more wealth and much more military resources and power capacities than any other society. And those can and will be brought to bear by Presidents Washington, Adams, and Jefferson in dealing with any kind of violent relations with indigenous people. That should be sure, right? But basically, the policy of Washington, Adams, and Jefferson is to try and expand peaceably by incorporating people, as Jefferson is making clear there. And however, if there is violence and it's not principally caused by settlers pushing west, right, then you deal with violence with violence. They're very clear about that. And they think you can do it very swiftly because bourgeois society has many more, or what they call civilized society, has many more resources to bring to bear militarily against indigenous groups. And so it can quickly defeat them and kind of set an example, right? Now, I say all of this, Amon, because the policy of the United States very much is about to change, right? It's really going to change principally with the rise of Jacksonian democracy, the age of Jackson, where it's not just going to be the old colonial policy of violently, coercively expropriating land from indigenous people and pushing them west, but it's going to have the added fillip of a racialism, right? Of a sense that indigenous people are, in some sense, essentially savage, foundationally savage, untransformable into civilized life, and therefore should be pushed west. I mean, that's how Jackson speaks, but there are people who even speak much more harshly in a kind of eliminationism, a kind of whatever language Abigail was trying to invoke there about a kind of final plan or final solution, etc. So I want to be clear about that. You need to think about what Jefferson is talking about, the policy of his administration, in its actual epoch, where the debate is, how do you expand west? And some people are saying, you have to expand violently, coercively, and radical bourgeois thinkers like Jefferson are saying, no, you can peaceably expand. You slowly pull people into civilized society or bourgeois society. You make it attractive and you give them full rights, and they will become contributing members of bourgeois society, which is not only to their own benefit, Amon, but is to the benefit of the people who already exist. The people already in bourgeois society, already in the United States, benefit from more people being brought peaceably in as free laborers. And you also need to think of what Jefferson is saying, not just against the people he's arguing against, who want a more violent, coercive expropriation. You also have to think about what follows in the era of Jackson, where a very violent, brutal, runaway expropriation of indigenous land takes place, a very violent transfer of their populations further west, and even some people talking about in a kind of eliminationist language, right? So you really need to think of Jefferson in that way, right? Properly, historically speaking.
The prime directive, is that a progressive or reactionary element of the Federation?
Oh, that's a great question, Amon. That's a really great question.
Is it a contradiction in what the Federation purports to be?
So I always thought, here's the truth. I ultimately think it's kind of romantic and reactionary. And here's the simple way I can put it. Gene Roddenberry was the creator of the Star Trek universe, right? And the principal writer of the original series. And even though I don't think he may have wrote several episodes of The Next Generation, but he generally oversaw the arc of its development. And Gene Roddenberry, in my understanding, was a right-wing social democrat. He was Canadian and right-wing social democrat. And my understanding, he had basically what I would call a kind of high 20th century, post-World War II, United Nations view that what would happen is human technology would improve, and basically we would have such great technology that there would eventually be material abundance, which basically allowed us to freely escape the question of scarcity. That is to say, you will eventually have socialism or communism when you have technologically material abundance for all, and there's no more question of scarcity. And he just thought, with the foundation of the United Nations and the creation of the UN Charter of Human Rights and the UN Development Agency, eventually everybody would be modernized and progressively included and enlightened into a world of human rights and incorporated, and it would all just unfold, and you'd have an end to war and peace and all of that. And I guess his view of the prime directive came out from that moment. You basically, you would not interfere with people. But, I think a more Marxist perspective, honestly, is no, bourgeois society is going to ceaselessly, relentlessly expand. And it's in question of incorporation into bourgeois society, right? And that perspective is, of course, one in which the Marxist perspective differs from Gene Roddenberry's in two ways. One, bourgeois society is relentlessly, ceaselessly expansive, and therefore there's not going to be any prime directive in which it doesn't expand. It's going to transcend every limit. The question is, how does it transcend those limits, right? Can it transcend those limits peaceably and in an emancipatory way for everybody? Or will it do it in a violent expropriational way? And then the secondary concern, and this is secondary, is of course a Marxist perspective would say bourgeois society is now in contradiction and crisis, right? We've had the full development of the capitalist mode of production with the Industrial Revolution, and Gene Roddenberry is wrong. There are certain problems that cannot be solved with simply expanding technology and expanding enlightenment. Liberal society, for the most part, can fix its own problems with what's good about it. To steal Clinton's phrase, there's nothing wrong about liberal or bourgeois society that can't be fixed by what's right with liberal or bourgeois society. I would say the Marxist perspective is that's not really true after the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
That capitalism or the capitalist mode of production is something wrong with bourgeois society that can't be fixed by what's right with bourgeois society. And that's, I think, what ultimately makes one a Marxist rather than a right-wing social democrat like Gene Roddenberry. Although I think that's a very legitimate perspective, and I think he was created a wonderful universe that has enriched us and many other people.
Let's finish with Abigail's take on the United States as a settler colonial state and what this means.
Settler colonialism is the practice of eliminating native people and building something else on the land that you take from them. The founding of the USA was undoubtedly a settler colonial process. I don't think there's anyone who really seriously disputes that anymore, and Jefferson definitely contributed to it. The Trail of Tears may not have aligned with what the young Jefferson said his values were, but in its effects, it was the kind of policy that he pursued whilst in office. Jefferson said the quiet part quiet, Jackson said the quiet part loud, but they both contributed to that pattern.
As you can probably tell, I radically disagree with her there, radically. It is not, she presented sources that were true and she characterized them correctly, but she is eliding a real transformation in sentiment and policy that takes place between what we might call the early 1800s, the age of Jefferson's presidency, and the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, the kind of age of Jackson and Van Buren's presidencies, right? That's really when it's under Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren that Indian removal really gets off the ground in the way she's talking about. And by the way, I'm sorry, Eamon, I have to add, the Indian removal that takes place in the 1830s and 1840s, right, during Jackson and Van Buren's administrations, is often removing people that are precisely the kinds of bourgeois subjects that Jefferson was hoping indigenous communities will become. That is, in places like Georgia and Alabama, in those places, the indigenous communities there have often settled down to become free family farmers, to become artisans, craftsmen, actually to become even enslavers. They have slave plantations, right? Jefferson is overall in favor of the eventual gradual elimination of slavery, but he puts no obstacles in the way of setting up slave plantations. and many of them become, they run commercial slave plantations. And so those people are entering into bourgeois society and are fully developing in their lands towards bourgeois society. And eventually they may even, right, be incorporated into the United States more fully instead of as separate tribal territories. Okay. So in some sense, there are many people there already on the way towards what Jefferson sees as their slow, gradual incorporation into bourgeois society in the United States. And Jackson's policy is to reverse that, to expropriate not only people who continue in what Abigail Thorne might call more traditional ways of life, but even people who've become bourgeoisified or semi-bourgeoisified, precisely because many ideologues and policymakers and public opinion makers in the age of Jackson now believe that indigenous people are no longer capable of living in civilized society and being peaceful, productive, sociable members of it, and therefore they can rightfully be expropriated and forcibly moved west. And I'm sorry, many terrible things happened to indigenous people during the American Revolutionary era through the Washington, Adams, Jefferson presidency. But by and large, it was driven by settlers expanding west and leading to violent conflicts, and only indirectly was deliberate policy involved. With Jackson, you're getting the deliberate policy, not only of the state governments, Georgia, Alabama, other places in the Southeast and beyond, you're getting deliberate federal policy to support the forcible expropriation and displacement of indigenous people westward beyond the Mississippi River. It's just different. And the language around, it's not just language and ideas, it's the practical reality. I mean, I think the both are inherently related. I don't think you can separate them. But both at the language of ideas and sentiment and at the level of practice and action, there's a real transformation there. I could not disagree with her more on that.
I'm not going to play the clip, but she goes on to conclude that because of what happens under the Andrew Jackson regime and beyond, Jefferson is therefore guilty of genocide, despite there being this transformation, as you say. I do want to ask, though, what do you make of the term settler colonialism, how it's used? And because Abigail, seems to place the formation of the United States in history as kind of a crime. The settler colonial project was a crime against history.
I'm genuinely not interested historically in sitting as a judge over the human past. However, because in some sense Abigail Thorne is inviting us to do so, I will don my judgment hat. I don't have a judgment hat or robes or wig, but I will play a judge. Guilty. All of the human past is guilty of genocide, crime, violence, all of it. I convict all of it. If you insist, if you really find that interesting or useful to sit here and sit as a judge or a moral arbiter or a legal arbiter or what have you of the human past, I knock my gavel. You know what? Oh, no. Eamon, this is lovely. Let's go Star Trek.
Yes.
Remember the whole kind of theme or the meta theme of Star Trek The Next Generation is Q, right? It's the Q collective, in particular, the single Q played by the great actor John Delancey. Q is sitting in judgment, right? From the first to the last episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, Q is going to sit in judgment of humanity. And by the way, what he really means at Q when he's talking about humanity there is bourgeois society. Like Q is basically saying this bourgeois society emerged on Earth and it's gone everywhere. And we're kind of nervous about it because it's making you somewhat godlike. And guess what? Q are somewhat godlike. And so we want to be certain like what's going on with you. But remember, Q sits in judgment. So I'll be like Q and I'll sit in judgment of all of human history, guilty. Human history is barbarism, it's crime, it's genocide, but it's every society. It's not just bourgeois society in Western Europe. It's not just bourgeois societies that spreads around the globe. It's all human societies. Primitive hunter-gatherers. Well, let's go back even further than that. Let's go back. I don't know if you're familiar. Readers might be from a very popular book by Yuval Harari. I'm forgetting.
Oh, God. Sapiens.
Sapiens, right? He talks about the emergence of advanced Homo sapiens as a great, huge genocide. What does he mean by that? Well, I'm not going to get it quite right, but he talks about how we can talk about when Homo sapiens had an advanced brain, right? Because we essentially can see that when these Homo sapiens come out of Africa into the Near East, they're repelled back by other, humanoid species they encounter, right? But eventually they come out of Africa through the Near East and they just roll over, right? They roll over other types of humanoid species, right? Other species similar to human beings, like Neanderthals. They just roll over that. In some cases, there's some, right, relationships, sexual relationships and
Interbreeding,
reproduction.
yeah.
Yeah, but for the most place, once we, advanced Homo sapiens, come out of Africa and spread around the globe, we wipe out most other human-like species. It's a great genocide, right? It's a great bonfire of the human-like species. And we've been destroying species left and right once we began to substantially transform nature, not just in the so-called Anthropocene, but really since we came out of Africa. We've been transforming species left and right. We've been ecologically transforming, damaging, killing, reforming the planet. And we became primitive hunter-gatherers. We began killing, enslaving, conquering one another. And then eventually we entered into ancient civilizations. And we became even better with settled agricultural life in towns and cities and reading and writing, division of labor, construction of armies and bureaucracies. We really became a great killing machine then. And those civilizations rolled over all the nomadic hunter-gatherers coming towards them. This European civilization that is crossing the Atlantic has been transformed by bourgeois society. It is a bourgeois civilization that is crossing the Atlantic. And yes, it brings brutal forms of enslavement, conquest, expropriation, murder, violence along with it. But unlike all other forms of previous forms of civilization, all like other previous forms of human society, it brings new forms of emancipation, of productivity, of prosperity, of freedom, of self-determination. And above all else, Amon, it transforms the collective consciousness of the human species such that we become collectively as a species self-conscious, self-aware, aware of ourselves, right? Aware of the fundamental grounds of our existence, which is society, and how that existence transforms over time in history. And we become aware of how we are collectively and individually producing and reproducing ourselves. And therefore, it makes it possible for us to try and transform and to do things differently, to reproduce ourselves in a different way, right? And so what happens in this violent, destructive, expropriational, colonial settler society that's developing North America, right? What happens there is there arises a self-consciousness of this need not happen like this way anymore. Actually, we can bring an end to all forms of human expropriation and violence and enslavement and unfreedom. And we should do this. And we should begin to think about how we can change policies and institutions and practices, not to eliminate bourgeois society, but to reform, improve bourgeois society, to incorporate enslaved and expropriated peoples into bourgeois society, not only improving their lives, but improving the lives of everybody already in bourgeois society. Because you must always remember the good news or the gospel according to Adam Smith, right? Which he makes very clear in The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith says everything I just said in The Wealth of Nations. Commercial society has unfolded around the planet incredibly, violently, brutally, but it need not be that way anymore. We essentially can expand commercial society and incorporate all peoples in it. And everybody, both those presently, or sorry, I should say currently outside of bourgeois society, and it will be improved by it, and those in it will be improved by it. But its expansion is coming. Its expansion is coming. There's no prime directive stopping it, okay? There's really no prime directive stopping it. And I'll go one more, Amon, in the whole direction, which is to say, I think the key for socialists, right, is to not accept any kind of distinction in organization or work across borders. Certainly, you shouldn't accept, that there's any kind of distinction in the United States and the sovereign nations within it. All workers across the United States, the sovereign nations within it, and beyond those boundaries should be organized, right, to improve the lives of working people, right, etc. And so I think for the purposes of that, that must be recognized. And our starting point, ultimately, I think, as socialists, has to be the radical bourgeois starting point, which is um, a kind of universal social and political task, which is to say that believing in any kind of fundamental or essential distinctions between people and their ways of life is wrong, or is romantic and reactionary, and rather that everybody should be peaceably, sociably, hospitably incorporated into a universal modern way of life, which we should collectively struggle to transform beyond capitalism into socialism. And Amon, if you allow me to, I want to go back and say something that I failed to say earlier, because Abigail Thorne really mischaracterized Jefferson and the collection of Native American artifacts. Okay. And I think she's doing something there deliberately, or actually, I don't want to say that. I don't know if she's doing it deliberately, but very famously, when the Nazis conquered Europe, right, and they began implementing their extermination policies, principally aimed at European Jewry, but also at Romani,
Poles, Ukrainians.
Right, exactly. They were planning to build these museums of the exterminated peoples. In fact, I can't remember the name, but the SS has plans for a very famous one in Prague. Their plans have been published. They were going to have a museum for European Jewry in Prague of the exterminated peoples and other peoples, and show their kind of ways of life of this exterminated people. And I think to some degree, I worry that, like, when young people hear what Abigail Thorne is talking about, that she'll imagine that's what, or they'll imagine that's what Jefferson was going to do. No, no, no. Yes, Jefferson is not planning to eliminate indigenous people. He's planning to incorporate indigenous people. But Jefferson is a great collector of many traditional ways of life. He's not keeping those Native American artifacts of a sense like, wahaha, we're going to eliminate all the indigenous people, or we're going to incorporate them and force them not to have any of these, forms of dress or forms of music or forms of oral life and poetry and custom or anything like that. Many, many, many pre-bourgeois forms of poetry, of oral culture, of oral tradition, of ritual, of practice, of religion are preserved and transformed in bourgeois society. I mean, just go to Britain and look at all the people running around in kilts and with bagpipes and stuff, right? There's no question that bourgeois society quite ruthlessly expanded throughout the Scottish Highlands, but nevertheless, preserved and incorporated many traditional Highland Scottish clan ways of life, eliminating clan social life, traditional forms of social life, but preserving things like bagpipes and kilts. So there isn't some wahahaha, Dr. Evil or SS, we're going to eliminate indigenous people, I'm going to preserve all these artifacts for some museum of the exterminated people, as the Nazis were well known to be planning in Prague and other places. That wasn't what was going on. And in fact, Jefferson is not dissimilar to lots of people in the Enlightenment. There's this kind of massive craze, right, for gathering all these artifacts and forms and concerns, not just from indigenous people, but from the Scottish Highlands, from Ireland, from Eastern Europe, from areas being incorporated in bourgeois society, where there's a worry as people become incorporated, certain aspects of their, let's call pre-bourgeois way of life might fade away and not be preserved.
Shoot, I just forgot what I was gonna say. I think it was gonna be something Star Trek related, actually. Um, oh, this is a slight detour, I think, but um, okay. And if bourgeois society is ruthlessly expanding, and the benefit of it for everybody is more freedom and also the potential for socialism, then what do we make of landback, which is something that Abigail pushes?
Yes.
Not in this video, but
What I would say is Lenin's line, there's no way out but through. right? There's no way out of capitalism. There's no way out of bourgeois society in crisis but through it. And frankly speaking, the United States, as a political entity, is not going to give any territory it's acquired back, right? It's just not. That's not going to happen. And the conditions under which landback, first off, landback has never happened. So it is a bad, false utopianism. It will never, ever, ever happen. Let's just be honest about that.
And if it
And
did, would we even want it to? What would be the benefit?
yes, if it did happen, the conditions under would be most likely to happen. And I know many of your listeners will be upset by this, but please just listen to me. You can, whatever, write your comments. What about a horrible, awful, imperialist, racist I am afterwards? But just listen to me. The only possibility for landback would be an absolute collapse of social and political life in North America. Basically, some kind of incredible social degradation in which the United States is collapsing, and basically it territorially fragments into different confederacies and areas. And then there might be some landback, right, indigenous territory.
Like the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yes, yes.
Land
And
back
so,
for the German tribes.
yeah, by the way, I'm not kidding you. A friend of mine, actually another member of Platypus, sent me. There was a conference going on in Germany where they began with this originally belonged to the indigenous peoples of such and such, right? So first off, landback is a false, bad utopianism. It will never happen. Second off, if it happened, it would be under conditions of extreme degradation in which the whole country, that is the United States, was splintering off into confederacies amidst civil war, collapse, etc. And third off, who are you giving the land back to? Because I want to tell you, when people say it will return to Turtle Island, I'm sorry. Turtle Island is basically an invention. In the way in which young people involved with land back today speak about Turtle Island, it's an invention. I don't mean to say as a historian there was not such a term that referred to a place, a particular geography in a particular time. That was the case. But the way young people use it in landback or in the Free Palestine movement, Turtle Island, it's a pure fiction of their imaginations, right? The history, since the settlement of North America, since the first Eurasian peoples crossed the landmass between today's Siberia and Alaska in the prior ice age and came down and settled throughout not just North America, but all of the Americas, there has been reoccurring warfare, violent expropriation, enslavement, conquest going on. Whose land are you going to give back to, right? There's Land Back Chicago, right? Like I've come across activists for Land Back Chicago in events and talks I go to where I live here in Chicago. Who are you going to return Chicago to? There's a whole history prior to the United States, not just going back to British imperialism, to French imperialism, to before that of expansion and conquest and slavery amongst indigenous peoples. So who are you
yeah.
and back to? So no, I genuinely believe the important thing for young people who want to think about the people of these lands, whether they live in the United States or Canada or in indigenous communities, sovereign tribal territories, First Nation territories in the United States and Canada, the best way to think about it is to organize to organize in civil society, to consolidate a socialist workers movement across civil society without concern for the borders of the United States, Canada, indigenous people, First Nations, what have you. All right. And of course, also without concern whether or not people are immigrants. Okay. Without concern for that at all. That's the best way to think about that, is to organize people, whether they're in a sovereign territory, a sovereign tribal territory in the United States or Canada, they're in Canada, the United States, whether they're immigrants or indigenous, what have you, native. There should be organization of people across those lines, in a socialist workers movement in North America with links to socialist workers movement in the Western Hemisphere and beyond. That's the best way forward, right? And I'm sorry, in that sense, land back is a kind of obstacle to that and must be viewed as an obstacle to that, right? just as reactionary as anyone who would claim that you should organize workers in the United States and Canada who are not immigrants. No, the minute somebody says you should only organize native workers, you're dealing with a total reactionary who will lead you nowhere, right?
Or people who say the Jews should get out of Israel because it's the Arab land, or they were there first, or vice versa, or because it's ancient Jewish land and the Palestinians should get out.
Yes, people have been moving around the entire world and ruthlessly, I'm going to use this as a verb, I apologize, genociding one another since more or less there were advanced Homo sapiens, right? And so as a result, it's really bourgeois society in crisis under capitalism that presents us with the first possibility for the first time in history as actually undertaking a social transformation self-consciously, politically consciously. Because not even bourgeois society, even though bourgeois society generated this potential, bourgeois society did not emerge in a self-conscious way. It unfolded largely self-consciously for centuries before it became aware, conscious of itself with the 18th century Enlightenment and a bit earlier in the 17th century amongst some early Enlightenment thinkers of the 17th century. Okay, so it presents this really first potential for emancipation. Now, if the Industrial Revolution hadn't happened, Amon, if the capitalist mode of production hadn't happened, we could just fully inhabit or embody Jefferson's ideals, the Abbé Raynal's ideals, Adam Smith's ideals, Hegel's ideals, Condorcet's ideals, Locke's ideals,
Rousseau.
Rousseau's ideals, Pufendorf's ideals. We could inhabit all of those people's ideals. We can't anymore, right? Because there is now something wrong with bourgeois society, i.e. the capitalist mode of production, that came out of it that cannot be fixed what's right with bourgeois society, i.e. its freedoms and its emancipations. And so, although I think a socialist workers movement is ultimately rooted in bourgeois discontents, right? It's designed to form a movement that gives rise to a party that is capable in a self-conscious, politically self-conscious way, transforming beyond capitalism. And for the first time in human history, transforming the fundamental grounds of our existence. Remember, society is the fundamental grounds of human existence, not the human individuals and not the gods, God, right? Society, the things we do totally together reciprocally, society is the fundamental grounds of our existence. And we've never transformed society in a self-conscious or politically conscious way. And socialism is the first attempt in all of history to try and transform the grounds of existence, society, in a fully self-conscious or politically self-conscious way. And landback is an obstacle to that just as much as any form of romantic or reactionary or nativist sentiment is.
Like the Prime Directive.
Like the Prime Directive.
I think that's the perfect spot to end, unless there's anything else you think we missed that we should.
No, I'm sure there's a lot of ground that we did not cover. I'm sure there's lots of things I would cover. I would just like to say that I think that Abigail Thorne's video overall is incredibly well done, right? I think anybody who watches this should go and watch it because I actually think that there's a lot of facts and data that's presented relevant to Jefferson and Jackson. I just think that the overall interpretation given to those facts is incorrect. Right. And hopefully, go and watch that video, then watch this video and think about the facts and data that she presents in light of what we've discussed here, because I think that it's overall a much more plausible and persuasive interpretation of those facts and data that's been presented here.
Thanks so much for coming on again, James.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Am.